The mist hung thick over the Smoky Mountains on that November morning in 2024. Park rangers had been working since dawn, their thermal imaging equipment scanning the walls of the old Double Spring Gap shelter. What they discovered behind those weathered boards would finally answer questions that had haunted the Appalachian Trail community for 31 years. Theodore Blackwood and Lucas Harper had vanished without a trace in October 1993. Two young men in their early 20s, full of life and adventure, had simply disappeared from one of America's most famous hiking trails. Their car sat abandoned at the trailhead for 3 days before anyone noticed. Search parties combed every inch of wilderness. Dogs tracked scents that led nowhere. The case went cold, filed away with thousands of other missing persons reports from national parks across the country. Before we begin the story, let us know in the comments which city you're watching from. We're really curious where you're tuning in from. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a rating. Now, 3 decades later, renovation crews had uncovered 2 backpacks hidden within the shelter's walls. A cassette recorder. Personal effects frozen in time. The discovery would reveal not just what happened to Theo and Lucas, but expose a dark secret someone had protected for over 50 years. The autumn of 1993 had been particularly beautiful in the Great Smoky Mountains. Theodore Blackwood, 24 years old, was completing his graduate studies in environmental science at the University of Tennessee. His professors described him as meticulous, the kind of student who documented everything. His field journals were legendary among faculty for their detail and precision. Every plant specimen, every weather pattern, every wildlife sighting recorded with scientific accuracy. Lucas Harper, 23, had been Theo's roommate since their freshman year. Where Theo was analytical, Lucas was artistic. His photography had already been featured in several nature magazines. Friends remembered how the two complemented each other perfectly. Theo would identify rare species while Lucas captured them through his lens. They'd planned this October hike for months, timing it perfectly with the fall colors. They were so excited about that trip, their friend would later recall. Lucas kept talking about some award-winning shots he was going to get. Theo had mapped out every shelter, every water source. They were prepared for everything. October 15th, 5 days before they vanished, Theo and Lucas registered at the ranger station. The log showed they'd arrived at 2:30 p.m., spending nearly an hour talking with staff about trail conditions. Ranger Walter Cross, then 28 years old and considered one of the most experienced backcountry rangers in the park, had been on duty that day. "I remember them clearly," Cross would tell investigators decades later. 2 college kids, but not your typical unprepared hikers. They had good gear, detailed maps. The taller one, Theo, asked specific questions about wildlife patterns, very thorough. The station log noted something else. Theo had mentioned meeting a volunteer at one of the shelters who'd been particularly helpful during their planning. The entry read, "Hikers mentioned ES from shelter maintenance crew provided excellent beta on trail conditions." Mason Rivers, 26 at the time, ran a local guiding service. His business records showed he'd corresponded with Theo weeks before the trip. Rivers specialized in taking photographers to hidden spots off the main trail, places where they could capture the real wilderness. His October calendar showed he was fully booked, with tours scheduled every day that week. "The Blackwood kid contacted me in September," Rivers would explain, "wanted to know about some backcountry sites. I told him I was booked solid, couldn't guide them, gave them some general advice about staying on the main trail." City boys like that had no business going off-path. The morning of October 20th started like any other day on the trail. The Clingmans Dome Visitor Center recorded Theo and Lucas arriving at 8:30 a.m. Security footage, grainy and black and white, showed them purchasing water and trail snacks. They chatted with staff for several minutes. Everything appeared normal. The weather that day became a point of confusion. The official National Weather Service report indicated clear skies and mild temperatures. However, several hikers later reported dense fog rolling in during the afternoon, visibility dropping to less than 20 feet by 4 p.m. This discrepancy would prove significant. Ethan Stone had been 22 in 1993, the youngest member of the shelter maintenance crew. Volunteers like Stone were essential to keeping the Appalachian Trail accessible. They repaired structures, cleared paths, and often served as informal guides for hikers. Stone's dedication was remarkable. He'd spend weeks at a time in the backcountry, knew every shelter intimately. Ethan was incredibly helpful, one former hiker recalled. He knew those shelters better than anyone, could tell you about every loose board, every water source, every shortcut. He'd been maintaining them since he got back from Vietnam. That detail would later raise questions. Stone would have been too young for Vietnam service based on his stated age. But in 1993, nobody thought to verify his stories. He was just the helpful volunteer who kept the shelters in good repair. The last confirmed sighting of Theo and Lucas came from a day hiker who passed them around 2 p.m. on October 20th. The witness, a local teacher hiking with her husband, remembered them clearly because Lucas had offered to take their photo at an overlook. "Such polite young men," she would say. The one with the camera was very professional about it, made sure the lighting was perfect. They seemed in good spirits, not tired at all. They mentioned they were heading to Double Spring Gap Shelter for the night. Double Spring Gap Shelter sat 5 miles from the nearest road, a modest three-sided structure built in the 1960s. It could sleep 8 hikers comfortably, 12 in bad weather. The shelter's logbook, a tradition on the Appalachian Trail where hikers leave messages and observations, showed light use that October. Most thru-hikers had already passed by earlier in the season. At 4 p.m. on October 20th, Theo made his final journal entry. The notebook, discovered with his backpack 31 years later, contained his typical precise observations. Weather conditions, flora spotted along the trail, a rough sketch of an interesting rock formation. The entry ended mid-sentence. E.S. Just arrived at shelter, says he has something interesting to show us about the... The sentence was never completed. Lucas's camera, when finally recovered and the film developed using special techniques for aged materials, told its own story. The last photos showed the trail, autumn leaves brilliant against a darkening sky. Photo number 31 captured the shelter in the distance. Photo 32 showed a figure approaching, too blurry to identify. Photos 33 through 36 had been deliberately exposed, the film ruined by opening the camera back. 3 days passed before anyone noticed something was wrong. Theo and Lucas had told friends they'd be back by October 22nd, but young hikers often extended their trips. It wasn't until October 23rd that concerns set in. Their car, a blue Honda Civic, still sat in the trailhead parking lot. Walter Cross was the ranger who officially reported it. "Standard procedure," Cross would explain. "We see abandoned vehicles, we investigate. Usually it's hikers who underestimated the trail difficulty, maybe got picked up by friends." But something felt different about this one. The search began immediately. Teams spread out across miles of wilderness. Dogs picked up scent trails that led to the shelter, then mysteriously dispersed in all directions, as if the hikers had simply vanished into the air. The shelter itself showed no signs of disturbance. No gear left behind, no evidence of struggle, nothing unusual at all. Mason Rivers joined the search effort on day 2, bringing his intimate knowledge of the area's hidden spots. If they went off-trail, he told searchers, they could be anywhere. These mountains don't forgive mistakes. Ethan Stone proved invaluable during those first crucial days. He guided search teams to lesser-known areas, suggested checking seasonal streams that might attract lost hikers. He worked tirelessly, often searching alone in areas others considered too remote. Nobody knew those mountains like Ethan, a fellow searcher remembered. He'd disappear for hours, checking places none of us even knew existed. He was desperate to find those boys. The search continued for 2 weeks. Helicopters with thermal imaging flew grid patterns. Volunteer groups from 3 states combed every trail, every ravine. The media attention was intense. 2 college students vanishing in broad daylight on a popular trail made national news. Then, as suddenly as it began, the search ended. No bodies, no equipment, no clues. Theo and Lucas joined the long list of people who simply disappeared in America's national parks. Their families held memorial services with empty coffins. The case file grew thick with theories but thin on evidence. October's chill turned to November's freeze, then winter locked the mountains in snow and ice. If any evidence remained, it was buried until spring. But spring brought nothing new. Summer hikers occasionally asked rangers about the missing students, but gradually the mystery faded from public consciousness. Only the families kept searching, hiring private investigators, following false leads that led nowhere. The shelter where Theo and Lucas were last headed continued to serve hikers for 3 more decades. Thousands of people slept within its walls, cooked meals on its worn wooden platforms, signed their names in new logbooks. None of them knew they were sleeping just feet from hidden evidence. Ethan Stone continued his volunteer work for several more years before quietly disappearing himself in 1996. He just stopped showing up, park officials noted. Said he was moving out west for family reasons. We never heard from him again. Walter Cross rose through the ranks, eventually becoming chief ranger for the district. He kept a file on the Blackwood Harper case in his desk, occasionally reviewing it, looking for something everyone had missed. Mason Rivers's guide business struggled after the disappearances. Despite having solid alibis, the association with the case hurt his reputation. He sold the business in 1995 and moved to Florida. Time moved forward. The analog world of 1993 became the digital age. Missing person cases that once relied on foot searches and paper flyers now used DNA databases and social media. Cold case units formed, applying new technologies to old mysteries. But Theo and Lucas remained missing, their fate unknown. The November 2024 renovation of Double Spring Gap Shelter was routine maintenance, part of a systematic upgrade of Appalachian Trail facilities. Climate change had accelerated weathering of the old structures. Harsh winters, stronger storms, and increased rainfall had taken their toll. The shelter needed significant repairs to remain safe for hikers. The renovation crew arrived early on November 15th, their truck loaded with lumber, tools, and modern equipment. Among their tools was a thermal imaging camera, used to detect rot and structural damage inside walls. It was this device that would finally break the case open. "We were scanning the back wall," the crew chief would later explain. "Looking for water damage. insect infestation, that sort of thing. The thermal showed an unusual pattern, a rectangular void that didn't match the construction plans. Behind a false panel, built with expert craftsmanship to blend seamlessly with the original structure, they found a hidden compartment. Inside were two backpacks, perfectly preserved in the dry mountain air, a cassette recorder, two wallets, a camera, and, underneath it all, wrapped in plastic, a collection of documents that should never have been in a mountain shelter. The call to law enforcement came at 9:47 a.m. Within hours, the shelter was sealed off, crime scene tapes stretching between trees. What had been a routine renovation became an archaeological excavation of evidence frozen in time. Every item was photographed, cataloged, carefully removed for analysis. The cassette recorder, a Sony Walkman model popular in the early 1990s, still had a tape inside. The label read Wildlife Sounds, October 1993. But when forensic technicians carefully played it, they heard human voices. A conversation, partially recorded, the tape running out before it concluded. 3 voices were distinguishable. 2 younger men, 1 older. The younger voices matched audio recordings of Theo and Lucas from home videos their families had provided decades earlier. But it was the third voice that would prove most significant. And what that voice discussed would finally explain not just what happened in October 1993, but why someone had gone to such lengths to hide it. The cassette recording was fragmented, the voice-activated feature capturing only portions of conversation, but what emerged painted a disturbing picture. The older voice spoke about something that happened in 1972, about documents that could never see daylight, about identity that wasn't real. Theo's voice, analytical even in casual conversation, asked questions about military service, about records that didn't match. Lucas could be heard in the background, his camera clicking periodically. The investigation that reopened in 2024 had resources the original searchers could never have imagined. DNA analysis, digital enhancement of photographs, database searches that could cross-reference information across decades. The first breakthrough came from the wallet identification. Both belonged to the missing hikers, but Theo's contained something unexpected. $300 in cash, untouched. This immediately ruled out robbery as a motive. The film from Lucas's camera underwent specialized development at the FBI laboratory. While photos 33 through 36 had been deliberately destroyed, the partial images on 32 yielded crucial information. Enhancement technology revealed the approaching figure more clearly. A young man in his early 20s, wearing the distinctive green vest of shelter maintenance volunteers. The timestamp on the camera showed 5:45 p.m., October 20th, 1993. Walter Cross, now 59 and nearing retirement, was brought in for extensive interviews. His patrol logs from 1993 were digitized and analyzed. A disturbing pattern emerged. On October 20th, Cross had logged his position as checking the Cades Cove area, 15 miles from Double Spring Gap. But a gas station receipt, discovered in archived expense reports, showed he'd purchased fuel that evening in Gatlinburg, which was in the opposite direction. "I don't remember the specifics after all these years," Cross insisted during questioning. "We covered a lot of ground back then. Maybe I got my days mixed up in the log." But the digital analysis revealed something else. The patrol log entry for October 20th had been altered. The original entry, barely visible under special lighting, had been different. Someone had carefully changed the location and times, making it appear Cross was nowhere near the shelter that day. Mason Rivers, tracked down in Florida where he ran a small photography studio, provided a crucial piece of evidence he'd never thought important. His business calendar from 1993, which he'd kept for tax purposes, showed something interesting. On October 19th, not the 20th, he'd guided a couple to a viewpoint near Double Spring Gap. His clients' names were clearly written: T. Blackwood and L. Harper. "I'd forgotten completely," Rivers said, studying his old calendar. "They must have booked under false names, used cash. I remember now, they wanted to see a specific viewpoint for photography, but that was the day before they supposedly disappeared. They were fine when I left them." This revelation shifted the entire timeline. If Theo and Lucas were with Rivers on the 19th and seen at Klingman's Dome on the morning of the 20th, then the shelter logbook entry dated October 19th made no sense. Someone had signed it with the initials ES, noting routine maintenance and mentioning 2 hikers had stopped by. But those hikers couldn't have been there on that date. The investigation turned to finding Ethan Stone. The volunteer who'd been so helpful during the original search had effectively vanished in 1996. No forwarding address, no employment records, no tax returns. It was as if Ethan Stone had ceased to exist. But in the digital age, everyone leaves traces. The breakthrough came from military records. The documents found with the backpacks included discharge papers, but not for anyone named Ethan Stone. They belonged to someone named Eugene Sawyer, discharged from the Army in 1972 under suspicious circumstances. The papers had been partially burned, but forensic reconstruction revealed references to an incident in Vietnam, a dead soldier named Raymond Stone, and an investigation that had been suddenly closed. "We ran facial recognition on every Eugene Sawyer in the system," investigators explained. "Nothing matched anyone alive. But when we checked death records, we found something interesting. Eugene Sawyer supposedly died in a training accident in 1972. His body was never recovered." The real Ethan Stone, Raymond Stone's younger brother, had died in a car accident in 1970 at age 18. His identity, investigators theorized, had been stolen by Eugene Sawyer, who needed to disappear after whatever happened in Vietnam. The man everyone knew as Ethan Stone, the helpful volunteer, was living under a dead teenager's name. The shelter maintenance records from the 1990s, stored in park archives, revealed more. Ethan Stone had specifically requested assignment to Double Spring Gap Shelter. He'd maintained it almost exclusively, often turning down requests to work on other structures. His volunteer file contained glowing recommendations, but no photos, no emergency contact information, no real background verification. "Back then, we were just grateful for the help," a retired park administrator admitted. "If someone wanted to volunteer their time maintaining shelters, we didn't ask too many questions." The hidden compartment in the shelter wall showed expert construction. Investigators brought in a master carpenter who examined the craftsmanship. "This wasn't done in a hurry," he concluded. "This took days, maybe weeks, to build properly. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. The wood was aged to match, the joints perfect. Without modern equipment, you'd never find it." The cassette tape underwent extensive audio analysis. Background noises were isolated and enhanced. The sound of wind through trees, distant thunder, and something else. The distinctive clink of metal on metal, possibly tools. The conversation became clearer with each enhancement. The older voice, Presumably Eugene Sawyer, posing as Ethan Stone, was explaining something about the shelter's history, about things hidden where nobody would ever look. Theo's voice, always the scientist, pressed for details. But these documents, they prove you're not who you say you are. Why keep them? The answer was partially captured before the tape cut out. Insurance. If they ever come for me, I need proof of what really happened in '72. Raymond Stone was going to report. The village, what we did there. The film development revealed another crucial detail. Photo 31, the shot of the shelter from a distance, showed something investigators had missed. In the far corner, barely visible, was a green backpack that didn't belong to either Theo or Lucas. Forensic enhancement revealed a name tag, E. Sawyer. Walter Cross's story continued to unravel. Phone records from 1993, archived by the telecommunications company and recently digitized, showed he'd made several calls to a number in West Virginia on October 21st, the day after the hikers vanished but before they were reported missing. The number belonged to a Vietnam veterans support group, specifically one that helped veterans with complicated military histories. "I was helping a fellow vet," Cross finally admitted. "Ethan, or whoever he really was, called me that night. Said there'd been an accident at the shelter. Said the hikers had found something they shouldn't have, that there'd been a confrontation. He was panicked, talking about Vietnam, about prison. I told him to disappear, that I'd handle the search when it came." The weather discrepancy that had puzzled investigators for decades suddenly made sense. Cross had filed a false weather report for October 20th, claiming clear conditions to explain why the search dogs couldn't track scents. In reality, the heavy fog that afternoon would have provided perfect cover for moving evidence, for creating false trails. Mason Rivers's testimony took on new significance. His guided tour on the 19th meant Theo and Lucas had seen the area before their official arrival. They might have noticed something unusual, made plans to investigate further. Rivers remembered an odd detail. They kept asking about the shelter maintenance schedule, who would be there and when. I thought they were just being thorough. The investigation uncovered a pattern of communication between Theo and someone signing themselves E.S. in the weeks before the hike. Letters found in Theo's university records showed he'd been researching Vietnam War records for an environmental impact study. He'd come across discrepancies in military records, soldiers who supposedly died but whose deaths were never properly documented. Theo was like a dog with a bone when he found inconsistencies, his professor recalled. He'd written to various veterans groups trying to understand some environmental damage reports from Vietnam. Someone must have responded, maybe trying to control what he learned. The digital age allowed investigators to reconstruct Eugene Sawyer's transformation into Ethan Stone with remarkable precision. Social Security records showed Ethan Stone first appeared in the system in 1973, just months after Eugene Sawyer's supposed death. The identity had been built carefully over 2 decades, complete with employment history, tax returns, and volunteer work that established him as a model citizen. But why had Sawyer kept the incriminating documents? Psychological profiles suggested a complex motivation. The papers were both his greatest threat and his only protection. They proved his crimes, but also proved why he'd committed them. The village incident referenced on the tape, investigators learned, had been a classified operation gone wrong, resulting in civilian casualties that were covered up. Raymond Stone, the real Ethan's brother, had threatened to expose it. Classic paranoid personality with guilt complex, the FBI profiler explained. He couldn't destroy the evidence of his past because he needed to justify his actions to himself. But he also couldn't risk anyone finding it. The shelter wall became his safety deposit box, visited regularly under the guise of maintenance. The search for Eugene Sawyer began in earnest. If he disappeared in 1996, he'd be in his 70s now, but likely still alive. The FBI used age progression software on the one photo they had, a blurry image from a 1994 park newsletter showing volunteers at a distance. They traced Social Security payments, Medicare records, any government interaction that might reveal his location. Meanwhile, the contents of the hidden compartment continued to yield evidence. Among the military documents were photos from Vietnam showing a young Eugene Sawyer with his unit. One photo was particularly significant. It showed Sawyer standing next to Raymond Stone, and the resemblance was striking enough that Sawyer could have passed for Stone's older brother, especially 20 years later when nobody alive remembered either man clearly. The cassette tape had one more secret to reveal. At the very end, after what seemed like blank tape, there was a final fragment of recording. A struggle could be heard, voices raised in alarm, and then Theo's voice, clinical even in crisis. "Lucas, document everything. Whatever happens, make sure." The recording ended abruptly. Lucas's camera bag, found with his backpack, contained not just his camera, but 3 rolls of unused film and something else, a small notebook where he logged every photo he took. His meticulous records showed he'd taken 48 photos on October 20th, but only 36 were on the camera. A second camera, or perhaps another roll of film, was missing. The renovation crew, still processing their discovery, remembered another detail. When they'd first opened the compartment, they'd noticed an odd smell. Not decay, but something chemical. Forensic analysis of the air samples revealed traces of photographic fixer, the chemical used to develop film. Somewhere in that shelter, possibly in another hidden space, someone had developed photographs. Walter Cross's full confession came in December 2024. Faced with evidence of his cover-up, he revealed what he knew. Eugene Sawyer had called him the night of October 20th, hysterical. There'd been a confrontation at the shelter. The hikers had found his hidden documents while exploring the shelter's construction, looking for interesting architectural details to photograph. Sawyer had tried to explain, but they'd threatened to go to authorities. "He swore it was an accident," Cross said. "Said there was a struggle. Someone fell, hit their head. Then the other one panicked. There was another accident. He didn't mean for it to happen. He was just protecting himself." But Cross's version didn't match the evidence. The methodical hiding of the backpacks, the careful construction of the secret compartment, the deliberate destruction of specific photos, none of this suggested panic. This was calculated, planned, someone covering their tracks with military precision. The breakthrough in locating Eugene Sawyer came from an unexpected source. A genealogy website user in Oregon had uploaded old family photos, including one from a 2010 funeral. In the background, barely visible, stood an elderly man who matched the age-progressed photo of Sawyer. The metadata from the digital photo contained GPS coordinates. The FBI had a location. On December 18, 2024, agents arrived at a modest home in rural Oregon. The man who answered the door was 76 years old, gray-haired but still robust. He'd been living as Edward Stillman for the past 28 years, working as a carpenter, attending church, volunteering at the local Veterans Center. His neighbors knew him as a quiet, helpful man who kept to himself. "I knew this day would come," he said simply when agents identified themselves. "I've been waiting 31 years." The story Eugene Sawyer told over the next several hours reframed everything investigators thought they knew. Yes, he was Eugene Sawyer. Yes, he'd killed Raymond Stone in Vietnam in 1972 to prevent him from reporting war crimes. Yes, he'd stolen Stone's younger brother's identity and lived as Ethan Stone for decades. But what happened in October 1993 was more complex than anyone imagined. "Those boys were smart," Sawyer began, his voice steady despite his age. "Too smart. Theo had figured out things about Vietnam nobody was supposed to know. He'd traced environmental damage reports to specific units, specific operations. He'd connected dots that should never have been connected. The meeting at the shelter hadn't been chance. Sawyer had been corresponding with Theo for weeks, posing as a fellow researcher interested in environmental impacts of war. He'd tried to steer Theo away from dangerous information, but the young man was relentless. Finally, Sawyer suggested they meet in person, hoping to convince him to drop the investigation. "I brought the documents to show him why they needed to stay buried," Sawyer explained. "The village we destroyed, the civilians who died, the cover-up that went all the way to Washington. I thought if he understood the magnitude, he'd let it go." But Theo, true to his scientific nature, saw only the need for truth. He and Lucas had already photographed some documents they'd found through other sources. They planned to publish an article about ecological destruction in Vietnam, using Sawyer's story as a centerpiece. They didn't understand they were threatening not just Sawyer, but an entire network of veterans who'd participated in classified operations. "The boy actually thought he was doing the right thing," Sawyer said with something like admiration. "He talked about historical justice, about environmental accountability. He had no idea what forces he was about to unleash." The confrontation on October 20th hadn't started as violence. Sawyer had tried reasoning, then begging. But when Theo revealed they'd already sent copies of some documents to his professor, when Lucas mentioned the photos were being developed by a friend back in Knoxville, Sawyer saw his entire constructed life collapsing. "It wasn't planned," Sawyer insisted. Theo reached for his backpack where he had more documents. "I thought he was going for something else. I pushed him, he fell backward, hit his head on the shelter's stone foundation. Lucas ran to help him, and I panicked. I grabbed a maintenance tool and—" The forensic evidence would later confirm parts of Sawyer's story while contradicting others. The cassette recorder had been running during the initial conversation, but the fatal confrontation happened after it stopped. The photos Lucas had taken earlier that day included several of documents Sawyer had voluntarily shown them, trying to explain his position. But the missing 12 photos, the ones never found, likely showed what happened next. Sawyer's military training had kicked in. He'd hidden the bodies using knowledge gained from search and rescue operations, understanding how to confuse tracking dogs and search patterns. The heavy fog that afternoon provided perfect cover. He'd scattered items in different directions, creating false trails that led nowhere. The bodies themselves were disposed of in a way that ensured they'd never be found. "There's an old mine shaft about 2 miles from the shelter," Sawyer finally admitted. "It's not on any maps. I found it doing maintenance work. Over 100 feet deep, partially flooded at the bottom. I used maintenance equipment to seal it afterward, made it look like natural collapse." Walter Cross's involvement went deeper than he'd initially admitted. Phone records showed he'd been in regular contact with Sawyer for years before the incident. They'd served in the same region of Vietnam, though not the same unit. Cross knew about Sawyer's real identity and had helped maintain the fiction, even creating false patrol records to give Sawyer alibis when needed. "We were brothers in arms," Cross explained when confronted with this evidence. "What happened in Vietnam, what we did there, it bonded us. When Eugene called that night, I didn't hesitate. I owed him that much." The cover-up had been meticulous. Cross had manipulated the search patterns to avoid the mine shaft. He'd filed reports that led investigators away from crucial areas. He'd even planted false sightings of the hikers in different locations, using his credibility as chief ranger to misdirect the investigation. Mason Rivers had been an unwitting pawn. Sawyer had deliberately created confusion about dates, knowing Rivers kept poor records and often mixed up his bookings. The October 19th entry was genuine, but Sawyer had manipulated other evidence to make it seem impossible, creating doubt about Rivers' reliability as a witness. The hidden compartment in the shelter wall told its own story. Sawyer had built it years before the incident, a place to store his documents where he could access them but nobody else would find them. After the murders, he'd added the hikers' belongings, perhaps thinking that if they were ever found, it would be long after he was gone. "I went back one last time in 1996, Sawyer admitted. "I thought about destroying everything, but I couldn't. Those boys deserved to be found someday. Their families deserved answers. I just hoped it would be after I was dead." The FBI's search of Sawyer's Oregon home revealed he'd been living with the weight of his crimes for decades. Hidden in his workshop were newspaper clippings about the missing hikers, updated missing person posters, even letters he'd written but never sent to the families, confessing everything. He'd apparently started them dozens of times over the years, but could never bring himself to finish or mail them. "Every October 20th, I light 2 candles, Sawyer said quietly. "I know it doesn't mean anything, doesn't change anything. But I remember them, Theo and Lucas. They were good kids who stumbled into something bigger than they could understand." The investigation revealed a broader network of cover-ups related to Vietnam operations. The documents in Sawyer's possession implicated several high-ranking officials who were still alive. The Department of Justice faced a dilemma: prosecuting Sawyer for the murders while potentially exposing classified operations from 50 years ago. The families of Theo Blackwood and Lucas Harper were notified on December 20, 2024. Theo's mother, now 78, had never stopped hoping for answers. "I knew he was gone," she said through tears. "A mother knows, but not knowing how, not knowing why, that was the hardest part. At least now we can properly say goodbye." Lucas's sister, who'd been just 15 when he disappeared, had become a missing persons advocate. She'd spent 30 years helping other families search for loved ones. Lucas would have wanted his story to help others, she said. Maybe now it can. The search for the bodies began immediately. The mine shaft Sawyer described was located using ground-penetrating radar and historical mining surveys. It had indeed been sealed with rubble and expertly camouflaged. When crews finally broke through in January 2025, they found what forensic anthropologists confirmed were human remains at the bottom, preserved by the cold water and isolation. Dental records conclusively identified Theodore Blackwood and Lucas Harper. They were found together, still wearing remnants of their hiking gear. With them were personal effects that hadn't been hidden in the shelter: Theo's compass, Lucas's backup camera with 12 exposed frames still in it, and a waterproof bag containing Theo's final journal entries, written while they waited at the shelter for Sawyer to arrive. The journal revealed Theo's growing unease about the meeting. His last entry, timestamped 3:45 p.m. on October 20th, read, "Something feels wrong about this. ES seems too eager to meet in person, too insistent on this specific shelter. Lucas thinks I'm being paranoid, but I've uploaded copies of everything to the university server just in case. If something happens to us, the truth about Vietnam needs to come out." The 12 photos from Lucas's backup camera, when finally developed, showed Sawyer at the shelter before the confrontation. He appeared agitated, pacing, his hands clenched. The final photo, slightly blurred, as if taken quickly, showed Sawyer reaching for something off-frame, his face twisted in desperation. Eugene Sawyer was formally charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder on January 15, 2025. Despite his age, prosecutors argued he was fit to stand trial. The case drew massive media attention, not just for the 31-year gap between crime and arrest, but for the Vietnam revelations it threatened to expose. Walter Cross was charged with accessory after the fact and obstruction of justice. His reputation destroyed, the man who'd been regarded as a hero ranger for decades was revealed as someone who'd helped cover up a double murder. He accepted a plea deal, agreeing to testify against Sawyer in exchange for a reduced sentence. The trial began in September 2025. The prosecution presented overwhelming physical evidence: DNA matches from the hidden compartment, the cassette recording, the photos, Sawyer's own confession. But the defense raised questions about the broader context, arguing that Sawyer was a man trapped by circumstances, trying to prevent the exposure of state secrets that could have damaged national security. This isn't justification for murder, the defense attorney argued, but it's important to understand that Eugene Sawyer wasn't acting out of simple self-interest. He genuinely believed that exposure of these documents would harm other veterans, destroy families, and damage America's reputation internationally. The prosecution countered with testimony from Theo's professors and Lucas's friends. They painted a picture of 2 young men whose only crime was curiosity and a desire for truth. The prosecutor's closing argument was particularly powerful. Theo Blackwood and Lucas Harper were killed not for threatening national security, but for threatening one man's carefully constructed lie. They died because Eugene Sawyer valued his false identity more than their real lives. The jury deliberated for 3 days. On September 28, 2025, they returned guilty verdicts on both counts of first-degree murder. Eugene Sawyer, age 77, was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As he was led away, he turned to the families and spoke his only words during the entire trial: "I'm sorry, they deserved better." Walter Cross received 15 years for his role in the cover-up. At his sentencing, he broke down completely, apologizing to the families and to the hiking community he'd betrayed. "I chose loyalty to a fellow soldier over my duty to the truth," he said. "I've regretted it every day since." The case's resolution brought changes to the Appalachian Trail management system. Background checks for volunteers became mandatory. Shelters underwent systematic inspection for any modifications or hidden spaces. The Double Spring Gap shelter was demolished and rebuilt from scratch, with a memorial plaque for Theo and Lucas installed nearby. The Vietnam documents that had triggered the entire tragedy were eventually declassified and released. They revealed a pattern of environmental destruction and civilian casualties that had been systematically covered up. Several veterans came forward with their own stories, inspired by the courage Theo and Lucas had shown in pursuing the truth. Mason Rivers, finally cleared of any suspicion, returned to Tennessee for the memorial service. "They hired me to show them beautiful views," he said. "I had no idea they were looking for something much more important, the truth." The families established the Blackwood Harper Foundation for Missing Hikers, using settlement money from the government to fund searches for other missing persons in national parks. Their first success came just 6 months later when they helped locate another cold case victim from 1987. In a final irony, investigators discovered that Theo's upload to the university server on October 20th had actually succeeded. The files had been sitting in an archived folder for 31 years, overlooked because Theo had mislabeled them as botanical survey data. When finally examined, they contained enough evidence to have exposed Eugene Sawyer's identity without the confrontation that led to murder. If Sawyer had just done nothing, if he'd never contacted Theo, his secret might have died with him, the lead FBI investigator observed. It was his attempt to control the situation that ultimately led to its exposure, and to the death of 2 innocent young men. The mine shaft where Theo and Lucas had been hidden was permanently sealed after their bodies were recovered, but not before investigators found evidence of other secrets Sawyer had hidden there over the years. Documents, weapons, and other materials related to his time in Vietnam painted a picture of a man haunted by his past, unable to escape it even after creating an entirely new identity. Ethan Stone, the real one who died in 1970, was finally given recognition. His gravestone was updated to note that his identity had been stolen and used by another. His surviving relatives, who'd never known what happened to their family name, finally had closure. The Smoky Mountains continue to draw millions of hikers each year. Most pass by the new shelter at Double Spring Gap without knowing its history. But for those who know where to look, there's a small bronze plaque attached to a nearby tree. It reads, "In memory of Theodore Blackwood and Lucas Harper, who sought truth and found tragedy." May their dedication to uncovering the past inspire us to build a more honest future. October 20, 1993, forever remembered. Their story serves as a reminder that in the quest for truth, the greatest danger often comes not from nature's wilderness, but from the secrets people are willing to kill to protect. The mountains that had hidden their fate for 31 years finally gave up their secret, proving that truth, like the mountains themselves, endures long after those who would hide it are gone.